The first quiet minutes of the year are supposed to feel peaceful. But for some people, they felt wrong. A man took his first drive after midnight and realized the road behind him never emptied. Someone else stopped for gas at 1:17 a.m. and found a place that didn't seem to belong to the new year at all. And one night clerk learned that the first shift of the year comes with rules no one explains. These are the stories that begin when the celebrations end and the quiet starts paying attention. I didn't plan on stopping in Barstow that night, and that detail matters more than it should. I was driving east through California on Interstate 40, trying to make it as far as Needles before sunrise. Not because I was in a hurry, but because I didn't want to spend another night alone in my apartment in San Bernardino. My father had died 3 weeks earlier, and since then, silence had started to feel heavier than noise. I volunteered for late shifts at work, took long drives after midnight, and slept with the television on. Not because I was afraid of the dark, but because quiet gave my thoughts too much room to move. That night, the desert was colder than expected. The kind of dry cold that makes your hands stiff on the steering wheel. And by the time I passed the last lit billboard before Barstow, my fuel gauge dipped lower than I liked. I told myself I could push it, that I'd find something closer to Ludlow. But when the low fuel warning chimed softly inside the car, I took the next exit without thinking, the kind of decision you make when you're tired and don't want to think too hard about consequences. The gas station sat just off the ramp, a single canopy glowing pale white against the dark desert, surrounded by empty lots and a closed diner with blackened windows. And the first thing I noticed wasn't how empty it was, but how still everything felt, as if the night itself had paused there. I pulled up to Pump 3 at exactly 1:16 a.m., according to the clock on my dashboard. And I remember that because I checked it twice, once out of habit, and once because something about the place made me feel like time mattered more than usual. There were no other cars, no trucks idling, no distant headlights on the highway. Just the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the faint whine of wind moving across sand somewhere beyond the darkness. The building itself was small, older than most stations along that stretch, with a faded Shell logo and a front window cluttered with sun-bleached advertisements that looked like they hadn't been changed in years. As I stepped out of the car, the cold hit harder, and for a moment, I had the irrational thought that I was the only living thing awake in Barstow. The pump handle was cold in my hand, the rubber stiff, and when I slid my card into the reader, it took longer than normal to respond, the screen lagging before finally asking me to remove my card. That pause, that tiny delay, was the first micro-hook my brain latched onto, the first hint that this stop wasn't going to be as forgettable as most late-night refuels. As the gas began to flow, I glanced toward the office window, expecting to see an employee behind the counter, maybe watching a small TV or looking down at a phone, but the interior lights were dim and I couldn't see anyone inside. The door, however, was unlocked, a small handwritten sign taped to the glass, reading "Open" in block letters. The paper curled at the corners, like it had been there a long time. I told myself the cashier was probably in the back, taking inventory or using the restroom, and turned back toward my car. But that's when I noticed the clock mounted above the pump. It read 12:59. I frowned, assuming it was broken. But when I tapped the plastic casing lightly with my knuckle, the second hand ticked forward, slow and deliberate, as if the clock was working perfectly fine, just not agreeing with the rest of the world. I checked my phone, which read 1:17 a.m. now, the minutes having passed without me noticing, and for a brief, irrational second, I felt like I had arrived late to something I didn't know I was supposed to be on time for. The gas pump clicked off, startling me more than it should have, and as I replaced the nozzle, the station door opened behind me with a soft chime that echoed too loudly in the empty space. I turned, expecting the cashier, but instead, a man stepped out who looked like he had been standing there for a very long time. He was older, maybe late 60s, with a face lined in a way that suggested sun and dust more than age, wearing a plain blue uniform shirt with no name tag and a faded baseball cap pulled low over gray hair. He didn't smile, didn't greet me, just stood there for a moment, watching me with an expression that wasn't hostile, but wasn't welcoming either, like someone waiting for something to finish. "You're cutting it close," he said finally, his voice calm, almost conversational, as if we were picking up a discussion that had already started. I didn't know what he meant, so I laughed softly and said something generic about long drives and empty roads. But he didn't respond to that, just nodded once and glanced toward the highway, which remained completely dark. When I asked if I could use the restroom, he hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping aside and holding the door open. And as I passed him, I caught a smell I didn't expect. Something like old paper and dust, the scent of a place that had been closed up for too long. Inside, the station felt smaller than it looked from outside, the aisles narrow, the shelves stocked with outdated packaging. Candy bars with logos I vaguely remembered from childhood, and bottled drinks coated in a thin layer of dust. The radio behind the counter played softly, but the signal was weak, dissolving into static between fragments of a song I couldn't quite place. And when I glanced at the register display, I noticed the date printed at the top of the idle screen read December 31. I told myself it was just another thing that hadn't been updated. Another harmless inconsistency in an old station that probably didn't get much traffic anymore. But as I walked toward the restroom at the back, that feeling of being slightly out of step with the place grew stronger. The restroom itself was clean but dated, the mirror speckled, the light buzzing faintly overhead. And when I washed my hands, the water ran cold, no matter how far I turned the handle. As I dried them, I noticed something scratched into the metal of the paper towel dispenser, shallow enough that you had to look at it from the right angle to see it clearly. It read 1:17 over and over again, the numbers repeated in uneven lines, some crossed out, some circled, as if someone had been counting something they couldn't finish. A chill ran up my spine, and I told myself I was tired, that grief had a way of making patterns out of nothing. But as I left the restroom, the radio cut out completely, plunging the store into a heavier silence. The man was still by the door, watching the pumps through the glass. And when I approached the counter to pay, he rang up the amount without asking how much fuel I'd taken, his fingers moving slowly, deliberately, as if following a routine memorized long ago. The receipt printed with a dry, mechanical whine, and when he handed it to me, I noticed the timestamp read 1:17 a.m., January 1st, but the year was wrong, the last digit smudged and unreadable, as if the printer couldn't quite decide what came next. I asked him how long he'd been working there, a casual question meant to break the tension I felt building inside my chest. But his answer wasn't what I expected. "Long enough," he said, and after a pause, added, "Longer than most people stay." I laughed again, softer this time, and told him I'd be on my way. But as I turned toward the door, he spoke once more, his voice quieter now. "If you hear it," he said, "don't stop again." I froze, my hand on the door handle, and asked what he meant. But when I turned back, he was already walking toward the back of the store, disappearing into the dim light beyond the shelves. Outside, the air felt colder than before, and the desert seemed closer, the darkness pressing in at the edges of the light cast by the canopy. I got into my car, started the engine, and for a moment, everything felt normal again. The familiar hum of the motor grounding me, but as I pulled away from the pump, the radio flickered to life on its own, the static resolving briefly into a voice that sounded almost like my father's, distant and indistinct, before dissolving back into noise. My heart pounded as I merged back onto the highway, and for the first few miles, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the gas station still there, the lights following me, but the exit disappeared behind a curve in the road, swallowed by darkness. I told myself it was over, just another strange late-night encounter amplified by exhaustion and grief. But about 10 minutes later, my fuel gauge dipped again, dropping faster than it should have, the needle sliding toward empty despite the fact that I had just filled the tank. Panic rose in my throat, and I pressed the accelerator slightly, willing the car to keep going. But when the low fuel warning chimed again, identical to the one before, my headlights illuminated another exit sign ahead, and beneath it, the faint glow of a gas station canopy. My stomach dropped. As I slowed, I saw the same faded logo, the same closed diner, the same empty lot. And when I pulled up to pump 3, the clock on my dashboard read 1:16 a.m. This time, I didn't get out of the car. I sat there, hands shaking, watching the pump, the office window, waiting for something to move, and after a few seconds, the door opened, the chimes sounding too loud again, and the man stepped out, stopping at the edge of the light. He didn't look surprised to see me. He just nodded once, as if this was how it was always supposed to go. The pump clock read 12:59. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and when I checked it, there were 3 missed calls, all from my own number, all time-stamped 1:17 a.m. I started the engine, slammed my foot on the gas, and sped past the station without looking back, ignoring the warning lights, ignoring the burning smell from the engine as I pushed it harder than I ever had before. The road stretched on, empty and endless. But this time, I didn't stop until I saw the lights of Needles in the distance, the sky beginning to lighten just enough to remind me that morning was coming whether I was ready for it or not. I made it to a rest area just outside town, where I sat shaking in my car until sunrise, too afraid to turn the engine off, too afraid to check the fuel gauge again. When I finally worked up the courage, it read full. I never found that gas station again. I drove that stretch of I-40 many times after, in daylight and at night, and the exit simply wasn't there, no matter how carefully I looked. I told myself it didn't matter, that some places exist only when you're vulnerable enough to need them. But every year since, on January 1st, at exactly 1:17 a.m., my phone buzzes once, a notification with no message, no sender, just a reminder that somewhere in the desert near Barstow, a pump clock is still waiting to change, and something is still listening for the sound of a car slowing down. I took the night shift at the motel in Flagstaff because it paid a little more, but that wasn't the real reason. The real reason was that nights gave me an excuse not to go home. My wife had moved out 2 months earlier, and the silence in our apartment felt louder than traffic, louder than the TV, louder than anything I could distract myself with. When I saw the posting for a front desk clerk at a small roadside motel just off Route 66, overnight hours only, I told myself it was temporary, just something to fill the space until things felt normal again. The manager who interviewed me didn't ask many questions. He glanced at my resume, nodded, and said, "It's usually quiet. Just follow the rules and you'll be fine." He said it like a reflex, like something he'd said to every night clerk before me. And when I asked what rules he meant, he smiled thinly and said, "You'll see them when you start." My first shift was scheduled for January 1st. From 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., the first night of the year, when most people were either sleeping off celebrations or driving home before the snow got worse. Flagstaff was colder than usual that night, the kind of cold that settles into your bones. And as I drove up to the motel, I noticed how empty the parking lot was. 12 rooms, only 2 cars, both dusted with snow, neither showing any sign of recent movement. The office lights were on, casting a warm yellow glow onto the cracked asphalt, and for a moment, I felt relieved, grateful for something simple and normal to focus on. Inside, the office smelled faintly of old carpet and cleaning solution. And the previous clerk, a college kid with dark circles under his eyes, barely looked up when I walked in. He handed me the keys, the logbook, and a single sheet of paper taped to the inside of the counter. "These are the rules," he said, already pulling on his jacket. "Nothing weird usually happens, but just stick to them." He didn't wait for questions. The door closed behind him, and the sound echoed longer than it should have. I picked up the paper and read it slowly. Rule 1. Lock the office door at 12:30 a.m. Do not unlock it until morning. Rule 2. If the phone rings between 1 and 3 a.m., let it ring. Rule 3. Do not check room 6 after midnight, even if a guest complains. Rule 4. If someone knocks after 1:17 a.m., do not answer. The list ended there. No explanation, no signature. Just those 4 lines typed neatly, as if they belonged in a training manual. I laughed under my breath, assuming it was a joke meant to mess with new hires. But as the clock on the wall ticked toward midnight, that laughter faded. The motel settled into a deeper quiet after 12, the kind where even small sounds feel amplified. The heater kicked on with a low rumble. The fluorescent light above the desk buzzed softly, and every so often, I heard the wind push against the building, carrying the faint smell of pine and snow from the forest beyond the road. At 12:30, I locked the office door, more out of curiosity than belief, and returned to the desk, flipping through the logbook to pass the time. Most entries were mundane, notes about late check-ins or malfunctioning TVs. But every few pages, I noticed a repeated phrase written in different handwriting. Quiet night. No issues. It appeared so often it felt deliberate, like reassurance written for someone who needed it. At 1:05 a.m., the phone rang. The sound was sharp in the stillness, and my instinct was to answer it, muscle memory from years of customer service. But the rule sheet flashed in my mind. I watched the phone vibrate slightly with each ring. my heart beating faster as the seconds stretched on. It rang exactly 7 times before stopping. The silence afterward felt heavier, as if the air itself had thickened. A minute later, the exterior motion sensor light flicked on, illuminating the walkway outside room 6. I froze, staring at the security monitor mounted beside the desk. The camera feed showed the empty walkway, the door to room 6 closed, the curtains drawn. No movement. The light stayed on for 30 seconds, then shut off. I told myself it was a stray animal, maybe a deer, and tried to focus on the TV behind the counter, but my eyes kept drifting back to the rules. At 1:17 a.m., there was a knock. Not on the office door, but from somewhere deeper in the building, a hollow sound that echoed faintly through the hallway behind the desk. I stood up slowly, listening. The knock came again, steady, deliberate, 3 times in a row, and then stopped. I checked the cameras again, my finger hovering over the control to zoom in on room 6, but Rule 3 stopped me. Instead, I sat back down, my mouth dry, telling myself that if there was a real problem, someone would call the front desk or knock again. No one did. The next hour passed in fragments, broken by small, unsettling details that felt meaningless on their own but heavier together. The heater shut off and didn't come back on for nearly 20 minutes, leaving the office cold enough that I could see my breath. The radio behind the desk turned itself on briefly, playing a snippet of a song I recognized from years ago before dissolving into static. Once, I thought I heard footsteps outside the office door, slow and careful, but when I checked the camera, the walkway was empty. At 2:12 a.m., the phone rang again, and this time, the caller ID displayed the motel's own number. I didn't answer. I watched it ring until it stopped, my reflection staring back at me from the darkened screen. The worst part wasn't fear, exactly, but the growing sense that whatever was happening had happened before, that I was stepping into a pattern worn smooth by repetition. Around 3:30, snow began to fall harder, thick flakes swirling in the glow of the parking lot lights. And for a while, I focused on that, letting the rhythm of it calm me. That's when I noticed the logbook had shifted on the counter, opened to a blank page. I was sure I'd left it closed. On the page, written in neat block letters identical to the rules sheet, were the words, "First night is always the hardest." I stared at it, my pulse loud in my ears, and when I looked up, the office door handle rattled once, gently, like someone testing it. I didn't move. The rattling stopped, replaced by a single knock, then another. My eyes flicked to the clock on the wall. 1:17 a.m. I blinked, convinced it had malfunctioned, but my phone confirmed it, the time having somehow shifted back. The knock came again, closer now, directly on the office door, and a voice spoke softly from the other side. "Front desk," it said. "I need help." The voice sounded normal, tired, the voice of someone who had been standing in the cold too long, and every instinct I had told me to open the door, to do my job. But Rule 4 echoed louder than the voice. I stayed still, barely breathing. The handle rattled again, harder this time, then stopped. After a long moment, the voice spoke once more, quieter now. "They never make it past the first night," it said, not angry, not threatening, just factual. Footsteps moved away from the door, slow and unhurried, and the clock jumped forward again. The digital display on my phone reading 3:48 a.m. I don't remember much after that, just fragments, the sky lightening imperceptibly, the snow easing, the sense of being watched fading with the darkness. When the day clerk arrived at 7, she asked how my first night went, smiling politely. I told her it was quiet, no issues. She nodded, as if that was the answer she expected. And as I gathered my things to leave, I noticed the rules sheet had been updated. A 5th line had been added at the bottom. Rule 5. If you make it through the first night, don't ask about the others. I never went back. I quit that morning, left Flagstaff before noon, and told myself I was done with night shifts forever. But every year since, on January 1st, at exactly 1:17 a.m., my phone rings once, the caller ID displaying a number I recognize now, the motel's number, still active, still waiting for someone new to pick up the rules and sit alone behind the desk, listening to the quiet. The first drive of the year wasn't supposed to mean anything. I only went out because staying inside felt worse. Midnight had passed quietly, no fireworks where I lived, no neighbors shouting, just the hum of my refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic somewhere far off. My divorce papers were still sitting on the kitchen table where I'd left them earlier that evening, folded once, like they might try to crawl away if I didn't keep them in sight. I told myself I was just going for a short drive. Nothing dramatic, nothing symbolic. Just enough movement to remind myself that time was still moving forward, even if I felt stuck. I got into my car at 12:41 a.m. on January 1st and headed east, toward the edge of town, letting the empty streets guide me without thinking too hard about where I was going. By the time the city lights thinned out and the road opened into desert, I realized I was on Interstate 40, pointed toward Needles, California, with no real plan beyond following the road until I felt tired enough to turn back. The Mojave at night has a way of swallowing sound, and as the miles passed, the quiet inside the car grew thicker, pressing in around the steady whine of the tires and the low murmur of the engine. The radio didn't help. Every station seemed to fade into static, fragments of voices slipping in and out like they were struggling to stay connected. So I shut it off and drove in silence, watching the reflective markers flick past in a hypnotic rhythm. I wasn't watching the clock until I noticed how long it had been since I'd passed another car. 10 minutes. Then 15. When I finally checked the time, it was 1:09 a.m. And the realization that I was alone on that stretch of highway settled into my chest heavier than I expected. That was when I saw the headlights in my rear-view mirror. At first, they were distant, barely more than 2 pale dots hovering low over the asphalt. But they were steady, not weaving, not gaining or falling back, just there, exactly where you'd expect another car to be if it had merged behind you and settled into the same speed. I felt a flicker of relief at the company, irrational as it was, and focused back on the road, telling myself not to overthink it. A few minutes passed, then more. The headlights were still there. I sped up slightly, just enough to test the distance. But they stayed the same, neither closing the gap nor fading away. When I slowed, they slowed too. That was the first moment I felt something was off. Not fear exactly, but the uncomfortable awareness of being matched. I told myself it was coincidence. Another late-night driver heading the same direction. Maybe someone tired and cautious. But when I checked the mirror again, I noticed the lights didn't bounce the way they should over uneven pavement. They hovered, unnaturally level, like they weren't connected to a car at all. Just 2 points of light keeping pace with me in the dark. I tried to distract myself by watching for exit signs, grounding myself in familiar details. And when I saw the sign for a rest area coming up, I considered pulling in, letting the car pass me so I could put whatever unease I felt behind me. But as I slowed, the headlights slowed too, maintaining that same careful distance. And something about the thought of stopping while they didn't made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. I passed the rest area and kept going. The road curved gently through low hills, the desert stretching out in all directions, empty and vast. And for a while, the lights behind me disappeared as the road dipped. I exhaled, feeling foolish for letting my imagination run ahead of me. But the relief didn't last. As soon as the road leveled out again, the headlights reappeared. Closer now, bright enough that I could see their glow reflecting off the inside of my rear window. My heart rate picked up, and I told myself to do something rational, something simple. I signaled and changed lanes. The headlights changed lanes too, perfectly synchronized. I sped up again, harder this time, pushing 10, then 15 miles over the limit. The engine responded, the desert blurring slightly at the edges of my vision, but the distance behind me didn't change. The lights stayed locked in place, like they were anchored to my car by an invisible line. I checked the clock again. 1:17 a.m. The number stuck in my mind for no clear reason, a quiet marker I didn't yet understand. The highway signs grew more sparse, the exits farther apart, and when my fuel warning chimed softly, my stomach dropped. I knew I had enough to make it to Needles if I drove normally, but the thought of slowing down now, of easing back into a steady pace, felt impossible. I glanced at the mirror again, half expecting the lights to surge forward, but they stayed exactly where they were, patient, unhurried. When I saw the sign for an upcoming exit, a small cluster of services listed beneath it, I took it without thinking, the decision driven more by instinct than logic. The exit ramp curved away from the highway, and as I slowed, my headlights swept over cracked pavement and dry scrub. For a brief moment, the lights behind me vanished as the ramp dipped, and I felt a surge of relief, so strong it almost made me laugh. Then they appeared again at the top of the ramp, following me down, unchanged. The exit led to a small frontage road and a single gas station set back from the highway, its canopy glowing against the darkness like an island of light. I pulled into the lot and stopped near the pumps, my engine idling, my eyes fixed on the mirror. The headlights slowed, then stopped at the edge of the lot, just beyond the reach of the canopy lights. They didn't pull in. They didn't turn away. They just waited. My chest felt tight as I sat there, debating whether to get out of the car or drive away. And in that hesitation, I noticed something else. The gas station was empty. No other cars. No attendant visible through the office window. The door was locked, a sign hanging crookedly that read closed, even though the lights were on. The clock on the pump read 12:59. I checked my phone. 1:17 a.m. The discrepancy sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold. I turned the engine off, listening to the sudden quiet, and that's when the headlights behind me shut off as well, plunging the far end of the lot into darkness. I sat there, breathing shallowly, telling myself that if whoever it was meant harm, they would have done something by now. After a long minute, I started the car again and pulled back onto the frontage road, choosing not to look toward where the lights had been. When I reached the on-ramp and merged back onto I-40, the road ahead was empty, And for a moment, so was the mirror. I let myself believe it was over. I drove for several miles without incident, my shoulders slowly relaxing, the tension draining just enough that exhaustion began to creep in. That was when I noticed the headlights again. They were farther back now, faint but unmistakable, reappearing as if they had never left at all. I felt a wave of dread wash over me, heavier this time because it was accompanied by understanding. Whatever was following me wasn't bound by the road the way I was. It didn't need exits or ramps or fuel. It just needed me to keep going. The realization settled in my mind slowly, like a thought I didn't want to finish. I thought about my apartment, about the papers on the table, about how empty everything had felt before I'd left, and the idea that turning back might not make any difference at all. I drove faster, pushing the car harder, watching the desert blur, but the lights stayed with me, unchanging, patient. When the outline of needles finally appeared ahead, a scatter of lights against the dark, I felt something close to hope for the first time that night. Civilization meant witnesses, meant rules, meant something that might interrupt whatever pattern I'd fallen into. As I exited the highway and drove toward town, the headlights behind me faded, then vanished entirely, and I didn't see them again. I pulled into a well-lit parking lot near a 24-hour grocery store and sat there, shaking, my engine running, my heart pounding, afraid to turn the car off in case silence brought something back. When I finally checked the mirror and the road behind me one last time, there was nothing there. I went home just before dawn, telling myself it was over, that exhaustion and emotion had combined to play tricks on me. For a while, that explanation held. Weeks passed, then months. Life moved on in small, uneven steps. But every year since, on January 1st, at exactly 1:17 a.m., my phone buzzes once. No notification, no missed call, just a vibration that lasts a little too long. And when I look out my window at the empty street below, I sometimes think I see a pair of headlights in the distance, hovering at the edge of the dark, waiting to see if I decide to go for another drive.